The humidity hung thick in the briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command, San Diego. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the front of the cramped space, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting. 23 of the Navy's finest sat before him, a mix of SEALs, intelligence officers, and support personnel, all awaiting details of what promised to be one of the most challenging missions of their careers. Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat in the back corner, her slight frame almost disappearing among the broad shoulders and muscled builds surrounding her. At 5'4" and weighing barely 120 soaking wet, she looked more like a college student who'd wandered into the wrong room than a decorated naval aviator. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the same crisp attention to detail as everyone else's. But somehow, she seemed to blend into the shadows. Morrison's voice cut through the stale air. "Gentlemen, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room." His eyes swept across the assembled personnel, lingering momentarily on each face. 72 hours ago, a CIA asset in Yemen transmitted coordinates before going dark. Those coordinates led to a compound in the mountains approximately 40 miles northeast of Sana'a. Intelligence suggests this location houses a high-value target we've been tracking for 18 months. The room remained silent except for the occasional rustle of paper as someone shifted in their seat. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her mind was already racing ahead, analyzing potential flight paths, weather conditions, and the tactical challenges such a mission would present. The target is Khalil Hassan, known to most of you as the architect behind the embassy bombing in Beirut last year, Morrison continued. He's not just a bomb maker anymore. Intelligence indicates he's now coordinating with Iranian operatives to establish training camps throughout the region. This man is directly responsible for the deaths of 43 American service members and God knows how many innocent civilians. A low murmur rippled through the room. Sarah had studied Hassan's file extensively during her intelligence briefings. The man was brilliant in the most dangerous way possible, combining technical expertise with an absolute ruthlessness that made him one of the most wanted terrorists in the world. Morrison clicked a remote, and a satellite image appeared on the screen behind him. The compound looked innocuous enough from above, a cluster of buildings surrounded by walls, tucked into a valley between two ridgelines. But Sarah's trained eye immediately picked out the defensive positions, the vehicle staging areas, and what appeared to be communications equipment on the main building's roof. "The compound is heavily fortified," Morrison explained, pointing to various features on the image. "Our estimates put between 30 and 50 armed personnel on site at any given time. They have heavy weapons, including at least 2 Russian-made DSHK heavy machine guns positioned here and here." Red dots appeared on the image. "Additionally, they've got patrols extending approximately 2 kilometers in all directions." Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with 4 deployments under his belt, raised his hand. "Sir, what's our insertion method? That terrain looks like hell for a ground approach." Morrison nodded grimly. "That's exactly the problem, Chief. Ground insertion is virtually impossible without being detected miles before we reach the target. The terrain is too open, too well watched. We've considered halo drops, but the weather patterns in that region make it extremely risky with crosswinds that could scatter a team across 10 miles of hostile territory." Sarah found herself leaning forward slightly, her mind automatically calculating altitudes, wind patterns, and potential landing zones. She'd spent countless hours studying the mountainous regions of Yemen and Afghanistan, memorizing topographical maps and weather patterns that most people would find mind-numbingly boring. "Which brings us to our primary challenge," Morrison continued. "This mission requires precision insertion at extremely low altitude, in challenging terrain, under the cover of darkness, with a high probability of enemy contact during both insertion and extraction. We're not just talking about getting in. We need to ensure our people can get out alive." The room fell silent again, and Sarah could sense the tension building. Everyone present understood the implications. This wasn't just another raid. This was the kind of operation that could go catastrophically wrong if any single element failed. Petty Officer First Class Danny Williams, one of the youngest SEALs in the room, spoke up. "Sir, what about fast rope insertion from helicopters? If we come in low and fast—" Morrison shook his head before Williams could finish. "Standard helicopter insertion won't work for this target. The compound is in a narrow valley, surrounded by ridge lines that extend up to 8,000 feet. Any conventional helicopter approach would be detected long before reaching the target, and the altitude limitations make it extremely dangerous. We're talking about flying heavy birds through mountain passes in the dark, with the very real possibility of surface-to-air missiles." Sarah's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what Morrison was describing, and she also knew that most of the people in this room had never attempted anything like it. The kind of flying required for this mission went far beyond normal helicopter operations. It demanded a pilot who could thread the needle between mountains in zero visibility, maintain perfect altitude control while managing power limitations at high elevation, and execute combat maneuvers that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. "The intelligence community has been working this problem for weeks," Morrison continued. "They've run computer simulations, analyzed satellite data, and consulted with aviation experts. The consensus is clear. This mission requires a pilot with exceptional skill in high-altitude mountain operations, someone with combat experience in similar terrain, and the kind of reflexes that can't be taught in a classroom." He paused, scanning the room again. Sarah noticed several of the men glancing at each other, probably wondering which of their usual helicopter pilots would be tapped for such a dangerous assignment. "Specifically," Morrison said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "we need someone who can fly no-E, nap of the earth, through mountain valleys at night, someone who can handle the power limitations of high-altitude flight while carrying a full combat load, and someone with the combat experience to make split-second decisions under fire. No-E flying." Sarah felt a familiar rush at just hearing the term. Nap-of-the-earth flight was one of the most challenging forms of aviation, requiring pilots to fly as low as possible, sometimes just feet above the ground, to avoid radar detection and enemy fire. In mountainous terrain, it became exponentially more dangerous, with pilots threading their aircraft through valleys and around peaks with minimal margin for error. Morrison clicked his remote again, and a detailed topographical map replaced the satellite image. "The insertion point is here," he said, pointing to a small clearing about 3 miles from the target compound. "It's the only suitable landing zone within reasonable distance, but getting there requires flying through this valley system." His pointer traced a winding path between towering peaks. The valley walls rise to over 7,000 feet on both sides, with a floor elevation varying between 4,000 and 5,000 feet. Weather reports indicate possible cloud cover and wind conditions that could change rapidly. Sarah studied the map intently, her eyes tracing potential flight paths and identifying hazards that others might miss. The approach would require entering the valley system from the south, following a river valley that curved through several S-turns before opening into the insertion area. It was doable, but it would demand absolutely precise navigation and altitude control. "The extraction is equally challenging," Morrison continued. "Once the mission is complete, our people will have approximately 30 minutes before enemy reinforcements arrive from the main road here." Another red dot appeared on the map. "The extraction bird will need to be in position, ready for immediate pickup, with enough fuel reserve to make it back to friendly territory despite potential damage or pursuit." The room remained quiet, but Sarah could see the tension in everyone's posture. This was the kind of mission that separated the elite from the merely competent, the kind of operation that required not just courage and training, but a level of skill that few possessed. Morrison straightened up, his expression becoming even more serious. "Which brings me to the critical question." He paused, letting the silence build. "This mission requires capabilities that go beyond our standard helicopter operations. We need a pilot with specific experience in high-altitude mountain flying, someone who's actually done combat operations in terrain like this." Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. She knew exactly where this was heading, and she also knew that very few people in the room would understand just how demanding the requirements Morrison was describing actually were. The aircraft we'll be using is an MH-60M Blackhawk, modified for high-altitude operations with upgraded engines and specialized equipment. But even with those modifications, we're pushing the envelope of what's possible. The pilot will need to understand power management at altitude, density-altitude effects, and have the experience to handle emergency situations that could arise with no room for error. Morrison's eyes swept the room one more time, and Sarah could sense the moment approaching. Several of the men were looking around, probably wondering which of their colleagues had the kind of mountain flying experience Morrison was describing. "So here's my question," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "Do we have any battle pilots present who have actually flown combat missions in high-altitude mountain terrain? Anyone with experience in NOE flight operations in hostile territory, specifically in conditions similar to what we'll face in Yemen?" The room fell completely silent. Sarah could hear the hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of aircraft operations outside the building. She noticed several people glancing around, looking at their colleagues with questioning expressions. Commander Morrison waited, his eyes moving across the assembled personnel. The silence stretched on, becoming almost uncomfortable. Sarah could see the disappointment beginning to form on Morrison's face, as he realized that none of the usual suspects were responding. That's when Sarah made her decision. Quietly, without any dramatic gesture or announcement, she rose from her seat in the back corner of the room. Her movement was so subtle that at first only the people immediately around her noticed, but gradually, as she remained standing in the silence, heads began to turn. The effect was electric. 22 pairs of eyes swiveled toward the small woman who had been virtually invisible just moments before. The silence that had been merely uncomfortable suddenly became charged with surprise and disbelief. Morrison's eyebrows shot up, and his mouth opened slightly in surprise. Around the room, Sarah could see expressions ranging from confusion to outright skepticism. She was used to these reactions. They were part of the price she paid for being a woman in a field dominated by men, for being small in a world that valued physical presence, for being quiet in an environment that often rewarded those who spoke the loudest. But Sarah also knew something that none of these men knew. Over the past 4 years, she had logged more high-altitude mountain flying hours than probably any other pilot in the Navy. She had flown missions in Afghanistan that would have challenged the most experienced aviators, threading her aircraft through passes that were barely wider than her rotor span, landing in zones that existed only on paper, and extracting special operations teams from situations that had gone sideways in the most dangerous ways possible. She had earned her reputation not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through the quiet accumulation of successful missions that others had deemed impossible. While her male colleagues flew the high-profile missions that generated commendations and media attention, Sarah had been building a resume of technical expertise and combat experience that was virtually unmatched. Morrison stared at her for a long moment, clearly processing this unexpected development. "Lieutenant Chen," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Sarah nodded once, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite the dozens of skeptical stares focused on her. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, actions spoke louder than words, and that the best way to handle doubt was through quiet competence rather than defensive arguments. "You're saying you have combat experience in high-altitude mountain operations?" Morrison asked, his tone carefully neutral, but Sarah could detect the underlying uncertainty. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied simply. her voice steady and clear despite the tension in the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could practically hear the mental calculations going on around her as 22 of the Navy's elite tried to reconcile the small, quiet woman they had barely noticed with the kind of pilot Morrison had just described. Chief Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice carrying a note of respectful skepticism. "Ma'am, with respect, what kind of mountain flying experience are we talking about?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "4 deployments to Afghanistan, sir, primarily supporting special operations teams in the Hindu Kush region. I've logged approximately 800 hours of high-altitude mountain flying, including extensive NOE operations in hostile territory." A murmur ran through the room. 800 hours of mountain flying was more than most pilots accumulated in their entire careers, and the Hindu Kush region was known throughout military aviation as some of the most challenging terrain in the world. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued despite his apparent surprise. "And your combat experience?" 47 combat missions, sir," Sarah replied matter-of-factly, "including 23 extraction operations under fire, 14 emergency medical evacuations in contested airspace, and 10 missions classified above my clearance level to discuss in this setting." The room had gone completely quiet again, but now the silence had a different quality. Instead of skeptical surprise, Sarah could sense a growing sense of curiosity and perhaps respect. Morrison nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant, I have to admit, this is unexpected. Your personnel file doesn't highlight this level of combat aviation experience." Sarah allowed herself a slight smile. "Sir, my experience has been primarily in support roles for classified operations. The nature of those missions doesn't typically result in high-profile commendations or public recognition," which was exactly the way Sarah preferred it. While other pilots competed for the glamorous assignments that would advance their careers, Sarah had deliberately sought out the challenging, unglamorous missions that nobody else wanted. She had volunteered for the dangerous extraction flights, the emergency medical evacuations, and the support missions that required technical flying skills rather than political connections. Morrison studied her for a long moment, clearly reassessing his assumptions. Around the room, Sarah could see similar recalculations taking place as her colleagues tried to process this new information about someone they had essentially overlooked. "Well," Morrison said finally, "this certainly changes things." 2 hours later, Sarah found herself in a smaller briefing room with Morrison and 3 of his senior staff members. The initial shock of her revelation had given way to a more focused examination of her qualifications, but she could still sense the underlying skepticism from some quarters. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Harrison, the mission's intelligence officer, sat across from her with a thick folder open in front of him. His weathered face bore the kind of deep lines that came from 25 years of military service, most of it in places where people shot back. He had been politely professional so far, but Sarah could detect the doubt in his voice. "Lieutenant Chen," Harrison began, adjusting his reading glasses, "I've been reviewing your service record, and while it's certainly impressive, I have to say it's also unusual. Most pilots with your level of combat experience have significantly more visibility within the community." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. In military aviation, reputation was everything, and pilots who flew dangerous missions typically became known quantities within the tight-knit special operations community. Her relative anonymity was unusual, and she could understand why that might raise questions. "Sir, I've made a conscious decision throughout my career to prioritize mission effectiveness over personal recognition," she replied calmly. "Many of the operations I've been involved in required a low profile, both for operational security and for the safety of the personnel involved." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with interest. "Tell us about the Hindu Kush operations. What specific challenges did you face that would be relevant to this mission? Sarah took a moment to organize her thoughts. The Hindu Kush missions were classified at various levels, but she could discuss the tactical and technical aspects without compromising sensitive information. The terrain in eastern Afghanistan presents many of the same challenges we'll face in Yemen, she began. High-altitude operations above 7,000 feet, with peaks extending well above 14,000. The valleys are narrow and winding, with unpredictable wind patterns created by the mountain topography. Weather can change from clear to zero visibility in minutes. She paused, remembering missions that had pushed her skills to their absolute limits. The most relevant experience would be Operation Highland Rescue, conducted about 18 months ago. We had to extract a reconnaissance team that had been compromised about 40 miles inside hostile territory. The pickup zone was at 8,000 feet elevation, accessible only through a valley system that required NOE flight for approximately 30 miles. Harrison made a note in his folder. What kind of opposition did you encounter? Heavy small arms fire during both insertion and extraction phases, Sarah replied. The enemy had positioned fighters on the ridge lines with clear fields of fire into the valley. We took multiple hits during the extraction, including damage to hydraulic systems and main rotor components. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. You completed the mission with damaged aircraft? Yes, sir. The team we were extracting had critical intelligence that couldn't be left in enemy hands. We managed to maintain flight control despite hydraulic pressure loss and vibration issues from rotor damage. The emergency landing was conducted at a forward operating base about 60 miles from the extraction point. The room fell quiet as the three officers processed this information. Flying a damaged helicopter through mountain terrain was challenging enough under ideal conditions. Doing it at night, under fire, with critical personnel aboard, demonstrated a level of skill and courage that commanded respect regardless of gender or physical stature. Major Tom Bradley, the mission's tactical planning officer, leaned forward. Lieutenant, let's talk specifics about this Yemen operation. Looking at the topographical data, what would be your approach for the insertion? Sarah had been thinking about this question since Morrison first described the mission parameters. She reached for the map that was spread across the table and traced a path with her finger. The key is altitude management and route selection, she said, her voice taking on the confident tone of someone discussing their area of expertise. The direct approach through the main valley is too obvious and too well defended. Instead, I'd recommend a multi-phase insertion using this secondary valley system to the west. She pointed to a series of smaller valleys that branched off from the main approach. We enter here at low altitude, following the river valley north for approximately 15 miles. The valley walls provide concealment from radar and visual observation. At this point, we execute a climbing turn to the east, using this ridgeline to mask our approach. Harrison studied the route she was tracing. That adds significant distance and complexity to the flight path. Yes, sir, but it also significantly reduces the probability of early detection, Sarah replied. The additional flight time is maybe 10 minutes, but it allows us to approach the insertion point from an unexpected direction, with terrain masking for most of the route. Morrison nodded approvingly. What about the extraction? Sarah traced a different path on the map. For extraction, we need to assume the enemy will be alert and potentially repositioning forces. I'd recommend a completely different route, using this eastern approach. It's more direct, but by the time we're executing extraction, the element of surprise is gone anyway. Speed becomes more important than stealth. Bradley made several notes on his pad. What about fuel considerations? These routes significantly extend our flight time. The MH-60M has approximately a 4-hour fuel capacity with standard load, Sarah replied without hesitation. With the flight profile I'm describing, including loiter time for mission execution, we're looking at approximately 3 hours total flight time. That leaves us adequate reserve for contingencies, including potential combat damage or weather delays. The three officers exchanged glances, and Sarah could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Her detailed knowledge of aircraft capabilities, combined with her tactical thinking about route planning, was beginning to overcome their initial skepticism. Harrison closed his folder and leaned back. "Lieutenant, I have to admit your analysis is more thorough than what I've seen from some pilots with twice your experience level." Sarah nodded politely but didn't respond. She had learned that in situations like this, it was better to let her competence speak for itself, rather than trying to defend or justify her capabilities. Morrison stood up and walked to the large wall map that showed the entire region. "The mission timeline is tight," he said, thinking out loud. "We have a narrow window of opportunity based on intelligence reports of Hassan's presence at the compound. Weather forecasts show acceptable conditions for the next 72 hours. But after that, we're looking at a storm system that could make flight operations impossible for at least a week." "Sir," Sarah said quietly, "if I may make a suggestion about the timeline." Morrison turned toward her. "Go ahead." "Based on my experience in similar terrain, I'd recommend conducting the mission during the new moon phase, which is tomorrow night. The reduced ambient light provides better concealment for our approach, but it also means more challenging flying conditions. Additionally, intelligence patterns suggest that compound security is typically lighter during the early morning hours, between 0200 and 0400 hours. Bradley consulted his notes. "That would mean launching the mission approximately 6 hours earlier than originally planned." "Yes, sir," Sarah agreed. "But it also maximizes our tactical advantages while the intelligence is still fresh." Morrison considered this for a moment. "Lieutenant, assuming you're selected as the pilot for this mission, how confident are you in your ability to execute the flight profile you've described?" Sarah met his gaze directly. This was the moment she had been preparing for throughout her entire career, the chance to prove that skill and determination mattered more than physical presence or gender stereotypes. "Sir, I'm confident that I can successfully complete the mission as described. The flight profile is challenging but within my experience level. The aircraft is capable of the performance required. The main variables are weather and enemy opposition, neither of which can be completely controlled, but both of which can be managed through proper planning and execution." "And if things go wrong?" Harrison asked. "If we take fire during insertion, or if weather conditions deteriorate, or if the aircraft is damaged?" Sarah had been asked variations of this question throughout her career, and she had learned that the only answer that mattered was honest self-assessment, combined with realistic contingency planning. "Sir, every combat mission has the potential for things to go wrong. My approach is to plan thoroughly for the most likely contingencies, maintain situational awareness throughout the mission, and be prepared to make rapid decisions based on changing conditions. I've successfully completed 47 combat missions using this approach, including several where significant contingencies arose." Morrison walked back to his chair, but remained standing. "Lieutenant, I'm going to be completely honest with you. When I asked for battle pilots earlier today, you were not the person I expected to volunteer. Your reputation within the special operations community is not as well known as some of your colleagues." Sarah nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. "However," Morrison continued, "based on this conversation and my review of your actual service record, it appears that your reputation may not accurately reflect your capabilities. Major Bradley, what's your assessment?" Bradley glanced at his notes before responding. "Sir, from a tactical planning perspective, Lieutenant Chen's analysis of the mission parameters is sound. Her route planning shows sophisticated understanding of terrain masking and threat avoidance. Her knowledge of aircraft capabilities appears comprehensive." Harrison nodded agreement. "From an intelligence standpoint, her questions about enemy disposition and her suggestions about timing show good tactical thinking. She's clearly done her homework on the target and the operational environment." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing multiple factors. Finally, he looked directly at Sarah. "Lieutenant, I'm inclined to approve your participation in this mission, but I need to be certain that you understand what you're volunteering for." "Sir, I understand that this is a high-risk operation with significant potential for casualties," Sarah replied. "I also understand that failure could result in the loss of critical intelligence and the continued threat posed by Hassan's operations. And you understand that as the pilot, you'll be responsible not just for your own life, but for the lives of the entire insertion team?" Sarah had carried this responsibility before, but never quite as explicitly as Morrison was stating it. Every pilot knew that their decisions could mean life or death for their passengers, but combat missions made that reality much more immediate and personal. "Yes, sir. I understand the responsibility, and I accept it." Morrison made his decision. "Very well. Lieutenant Chen, you are hereby designated as primary pilot for Operation Mountain Strike. You'll work directly with Major Bradley on final mission planning, and you'll have full authority over all flight-related decisions during the mission execution." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with apprehension. This was the opportunity she had been preparing for throughout her career, but it also represented the greatest challenge she had ever faced. "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you." "I'm sure you won't," Morrison replied. "Now, let's get to work on the details." For the next 4 hours, Sarah worked with Bradley and Harrison to refine every aspect of the mission plan. They studied satellite imagery until she had memorized every ridge and valley along the planned route. They analyzed weather patterns and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. They calculated fuel consumption down to the minute and identified alternate landing zones in case the primary insertion point was compromised. By the time they finished, Sarah had answered dozens of technical questions and provided detailed explanations for every aspect of her proposed flight plan. More importantly, she had gained the confidence of Morrison's staff, who had started the day skeptical of her capabilities and ended it impressed by her professionalism and expertise. As the meeting broke up, Morrison approached her privately. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that I still have some concerns about this mission." Sarah waited for him to continue, knowing that honest feedback was more valuable than false encouragement. "My concerns aren't about your flying ability," he clarified. "Based on what I've seen today, you may be the most qualified pilot available for this type of operation. My concerns are about the mission itself. We're asking you to fly into extremely hostile territory with minimal backup support to extract personnel who may be under fire." Sarah nodded. "Sir, those are legitimate concerns, but they're also exactly the reasons why this mission requires someone with extensive combat experience rather than just technical flying skills." Morrison smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow night is going to be a long one." As Sarah walked out of the briefing room, she reflected on the strange turns her career had taken. 6 months ago, she had been flying routine training missions and wondering if she would ever get the chance to prove herself in a high-stakes operation. Now she was preparing for what might be the most important mission of her life. The next 18 hours would be spent in final preparations, aircraft inspection, weather briefings, coordination with the ground team, and the dozens of small details that could mean the difference between success and disaster. But for now, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow night, she would have the chance to show the world what she was truly capable of, and she intended to make the most of that opportunity. The pre-dawn darkness at the forward operating base was broken only by the red-filtered flashlights of the ground crew conducting final checks on the MH-60M Black Hawk. Sarah completed her walk-around inspection methodically, checking every critical component despite having done the same inspection 3 hours earlier. In combat aviation, redundancy wasn't just preferred, it was survival. The aircraft looked lethal in the dim light, its angular fuselage modified with additional armor plating and defensive systems. The upgraded engines hummed quietly at idle, their enhanced power output specifically designed for high-altitude operations. Sarah ran her hand along the main rotor blade, feeling for any irregularities that might indicate stress or damage. "Bird looks good, Lieutenant," said Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the crew chief who had been working on Army helicopters for 15 years. His initial skepticism about having a female pilot had given way to professional respect after watching her meticulous approach to mission preparation. "Engines are running smooth, all systems check green." "Thanks, Sergeant," Sarah replied, climbing into the pilot's seat and beginning her internal checks. The familiar routine of switch positions and system status helped calm her pre-mission nerves. Outside, the 8-man SEAL team was conducting final equipment checks under the watchful eye of Commander Morrison. Team leader Lieutenant Tom Reynolds approached the aircraft and leaned into the cabin. At 6'2" with 20 pounds of muscle on the smallest member of his team, he still looked like a college linebacker despite 8 years of special operations experience. His initial doubts about Sarah had been replaced by cautious optimism after yesterday's thorough mission briefing. "How we looking, Lieutenant?" Reynolds asked, his voice carrying the focused intensity that characterized special operations personnel before a high-stakes mission. "All systems operational," Sarah replied, completing her checklist. "Weather reports show clear conditions along our route with light variable winds. We're go for launch in 15 minutes. Reynolds nodded and turned to address his team. "Listen up. We've been over this a dozen times, but I'm going to say it once more. Lieutenant Chen is one of the most experienced mountain pilots in the Navy. She's flown more combat missions in terrain like this than probably anyone else available. When we get in that bird, she's in charge of getting us there and back alive. Any questions about flight operations go through me to her. Clear?" The unanimous hoo-yah from his team indicated their understanding, though Sarah noticed a couple of the younger operators glancing at her with expressions that suggested they were still processing the idea of trusting their lives to someone who looked like she should be teaching elementary school rather than flying combat missions. Morrison approached the aircraft and climbed into the cabin for final coordination. "Lieutenant, latest intelligence confirms Hassan is still at the compound. No significant changes to enemy disposition, though we're seeing increased radio traffic that might indicate higher alert status." Sarah absorbed this information while continuing her pre-flight checks. Increased enemy alertness meant they would need to be even more careful about their approach route and timing. "Sir, I recommend we stick with the eastern approach for insertion as planned, but I'd like to adjust our extraction route to include this alternate valley system in case we need to avoid ground fire," she said, pointing to the map strapped to her knee board. Morrison studied the route change and nodded approval. "Good thinking. What's your fuel status for the extended route?" "Still within acceptable limits, sir. We'll have approximately 45 minutes of reserve fuel, which should be adequate for combat contingencies." "Outstanding. Execute when ready." As Morrison left the aircraft, Sarah keyed her radio. "Tower, Dark Knight 1 requesting departure clearance." "Dark Knight 1, you are cleared for departure. Winds light and variable, visibility unlimited. Good hunting." Sarah increased engine power gradually, feeling the familiar vibration as the Black Hawk lifted into the night sky. The aircraft climbed steadily, its upgraded engines handling the initial ascent with ease. Below them, the lights of the forward operating base quickly disappeared into the darkness. "Dark Knight 1 airborne," she reported to the Tactical Operations Center. "Proceeding to initial navigation checkpoint." The first 40 minutes of flight were routine, following established air corridors through relatively safe airspace. Sarah used this time to fine-tune her navigation systems and monitor weather conditions ahead. The SEAL team sat quietly in the cabin, each man focused on his own mental preparation for the mission ahead. As they approached the border into hostile territory, Sarah switched off all external lights and activated the aircraft's defensive systems. From this point forward, they would be flying entirely on night vision goggles, following terrain features rather than electronic navigation aids that might give away their position. 2 minutes to initial approach point, Sarah announced to the team. From here on, we maintain radio silence unless it's an emergency. The landscape below them changed dramatically as they entered the mountain region. What had been relatively flat desert terrain suddenly gave way to towering ridgelines and deep valleys, carved by centuries of erosion. Sarah descended to just 200 feet above the valley floor, using the terrain to mask their approach from enemy radar systems. The flight became immediately more challenging. The valley floor rose and fell unpredictably, forcing constant altitude adjustments. Crosswinds created by the mountain topography buffeted the aircraft, requiring continuous control inputs to maintain precise flight path. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could see the valley walls closing in on both sides, sometimes leaving only a few hundred feet of clearance for the rotor blades. Reynolds leaned forward from his position in the cabin. "How you doing up there, Lieutenant?" "Smooth as silk," Sarah replied, though she was working harder than she wanted to admit. The combination of high altitude, terrain masking, and night flight created a workload that would challenge any pilot. But this was exactly the kind of flying she had been training for throughout her career. 20 minutes into the approach phase, Sarah spotted the first indication of enemy activity. Faint lights in a side valley indicated a patrol or outpost that hadn't appeared in the intelligence briefings. She made a subtle course correction to avoid overflying the position, adding 3 minutes to their flight time but maintaining the element of surprise. "Contact left, 2 o'clock low," she whispered into her headset, alerting Reynolds to the enemy presence without breaking radio silence with the Tactical Operations Center. Reynolds acknowledged with 2 clicks on his radio, then passed the information to his team using hand signals. The insertion point appeared exactly where the satellite imagery had indicated, a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would provide some concealment for the landing. Sarah circled the area once at a safe distance, using her night vision equipment to scan for any signs of enemy presence or obstacles that might have appeared since the last reconnaissance. "Landing zone appears clear," she announced to the team. 30 seconds to insertion. The approach to the landing zone required threading the aircraft between 2 rock formations with less than 50 feet of clearance on each side. Sarah had to maintain perfect altitude control while managing the power requirements of high-altitude flight and the unpredictable wind patterns created by the surrounding terrain. As the Black Hawk touched down in the small clearing, the SEAL team immediately deployed according to their rehearsed procedures. Within 90 seconds, all 8 operators were on the ground and moving toward their objective. Sarah kept the engines running at flight idle, ready for immediate departure if the landing zone came under attack. "Dark Knight 1, Bravo team is clear and moving to objective," Reynolds reported over the radio. "Copy, Bravo team, standing by for extraction call." The next hour was the longest of Sarah's career. She sat alone in the aircraft, monitoring radio frequencies and watching for any sign of enemy activity while the SEAL team moved toward the compound. Every few minutes, she heard brief status reports indicating their progress, but the sparse communication meant she had little information about what was happening. At 0347 hours, the sound of distant gunfire broke the mountain silence. Sarah immediately began her engine start procedures, bringing the aircraft to full operational status in case emergency extraction became necessary. "Dark Knight 1, Bravo 6, came Reynolds' voice over the radio, slightly breathless from combat exertion. "Package secured, but we've got company moving in from the east. Request immediate extraction." "Copy, Bravo 6, proceeding to extraction point now." Sarah lifted off from the landing zone and began the short flight to the planned extraction point, which was located on a ridgeline about 2 miles from the compound. As she approached, She could see muzzle flashes in the valley below where the SEAL team was conducting a fighting withdrawal toward the pickup zone. The extraction point was even more challenging than the insertion. The ridgeline landing zone was barely large enough for the aircraft, with steep drop-offs on 3 sides and only one viable approach path. Worse, enemy forces were beginning to close in from multiple directions. "Bravo 6, Dark Knight 1 is 1 minute out," Sarah transmitted. "Copy, Dark Knight 1. Be advised, we're taking fire from multiple positions. Landing zone is hot." Sarah could see tracer fire streaking across the valley as she approached the extraction point. The enemy had managed to position fighters on several ridge lines, creating crossfires that would make the extraction extremely dangerous. "Bravo 6, I'm seeing heavy ground fire around your position. Can you mark your location?" "Roger, popping smoke now." A red smoke grenade blossomed on the ridgeline, marking the SEAL team's position. Sarah could also see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different enemy positions, all with clear fields of fire across the extraction zone. This was the moment that defined combat pilots, the decision point where technical skill met moral courage. Sarah could have recommended aborting the extraction and finding an alternate pickup zone, which would have been the safe decision from an aviation standpoint. But she could see that the SEAL team was surrounded, with their only escape route leading directly through the hot landing zone. "Bravo 6, I'm coming in hot. Suppress those ridgeline positions on my approach." "Roger, Dark Knight 1. We've got your back." Sarah rolled the Blackhawk into a steep diving approach toward the ridgeline, using speed and surprise to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the aircraft as enemy fighters tried to track her movement. She could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the rotor blades. The approach required split-second timing and precise control. Too fast, and she would overshoot the small landing zone and crash into the rocks beyond. Too slow, and the aircraft would present an easy target for enemy gunners. Too high, and the SEAL team wouldn't be able to reach the cabin. Too low, and the main rotor would strike the rocky outcroppings. As the aircraft touched down on the ridgeline, Sarah felt the impact of enemy rounds striking the fuselage. The SEAL team sprinted toward the Blackhawk from their defensive positions, laying down covering fire as they moved. Reynolds and 3 of his men reached the aircraft first, then provided security while the remaining team members loaded a bound prisoner, presumably Hassan, into the cabin. "Go, go, go!" Reynolds shouted over the sound of gunfire and rotor noise. Sarah applied power for takeoff just as a heavy machine gun opened up from a previously undetected position. The .50 caliber rounds stitched across the landing zone, several striking the aircraft's tail section. Warning lights illuminated on her instrument panel, indicating hydraulic system damage. Despite the damage, the Blackhawk lifted off successfully, but as Sarah attempted to accelerate away from the landing zone, she realized the aircraft's performance was significantly degraded. The hydraulic failure was affecting flight control response, and she could feel unusual vibrations through the airframe. "Dark Knight 1, Bravo 6. How bad is the damage?" Reynolds asked, having noticed the aircraft's sluggish response. "We've lost primary hydraulic system," Sarah replied, fighting to maintain control as they cleared the ridgeline. "Flight controls are heavy, and I'm showing multiple warning indicators. We can make it back, but it's going to be a challenging flight." What followed was 35 minutes of the most demanding flying Sarah had ever experienced. The combination of combat damage, high-altitude operation, and night flight conditions pushed her skills to their absolute limit. Without hydraulic assistance, every control input required significant physical effort. The damaged tail section created asymmetric drag that constantly tried to pull the aircraft off course. Worse, the alternate extraction route she had planned was now too risky given the aircraft's condition. She was forced to fly a more direct path that took them closer to known enemy positions, but which reduced flight time and fuel consumption. Halfway through the return flight, they encountered the weather front that had been forecast for later in the evening. What had been clear skies suddenly became a maze of clouds and turbulence that made instrument flying mandatory. Sarah was now flying a damaged aircraft, through mountains, at night, in clouds, with minimal margin for error. "How we doing up there, Lieutenant?" Reynolds asked, during a brief lull in the turbulence. "Still flying," Sarah replied, which was about the most positive assessment she could honestly provide. The weather cleared just as they approached friendly airspace, revealing the lights of the forward operating base in the distance. Sarah had never been so happy to see any sight in her life. But even the landing presented challenges, as the damaged hydraulic system made precise control movements difficult. She brought the Black Hawk in on final approach with extra airspeed to compensate for the reduced control authority. The landing was harder than usual, but successful. As the aircraft settled on the landing pad and Sarah finally reduced power to idle, she realized she was gripping the controls so tightly that her hands were cramping. "Dark Knight 1 is on deck," she reported to the control tower, trying to keep the exhaustion out of her voice. The post-mission debriefing revealed just how successful the operation had been. Hassan was indeed in custody, along with intelligence materials that would significantly disrupt terrorist operations throughout the region. More importantly, from Sarah's perspective, all 8 SEAL team members had returned safely despite the intense combat they had faced. Commander Morrison approached her as she completed her post-flight inspection of the damaged aircraft. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology." Sarah looked up from her checklist, genuinely surprised. "Sir? When you volunteered for this mission yesterday, I had my doubts. Not about your technical qualifications, but about whether you had the experience to handle the kind of challenges we faced tonight." He gestured toward the Black Hawk, which showed clear evidence of battle damage. "You've just completed one of the most demanding combat flights I've ever seen. You got our people in safely, extracted them under fire, and brought home a damaged aircraft that many pilots would have crashed." Sarah nodded respectfully but wasn't sure how to respond. Throughout her career, she had learned that actions spoke louder than words, and tonight, her actions had spoken quite clearly. "More importantly," Morrison continued, "you made decisions tonight that saved lives. When Lieutenant Reynolds called for emergency extraction, you could have recommended alternate solutions that would have been safer for you and the aircraft. Instead, you chose to fly into a hot landing zone because you knew it was the best chance for the team's survival." Reynolds approached during Morrison's comments. "Sir, if I may," he said, then turned to Sarah. "Lieutenant, I've flown with a lot of pilots over the years. Some were technically proficient, some were brave, some were good under pressure. You're the first pilot I've flown with who was all 3 when it really mattered." Coming from a SEAL team leader, this was high praise indeed. But what impressed Sarah most was the obvious sincerity in Reynolds's voice. "Thank you, sir," she replied simply. "It was an honor to fly with your team." Later that morning, after the intelligence materials had been processed and Hassan had been transferred to appropriate authorities, Sarah found herself back in the same briefing room where this had all started 2 days earlier. But now, instead of sitting unnoticed in the back corner, she was at the front table with Morrison and his senior staff. "Lieutenant Chen," Morrison began, "I've submitted my mission report to higher headquarters, along with a recommendation for commendation. But more than that, I've recommended that you be considered for any future operations requiring this type of specialized flying." Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. This mission had been the culmination of years of preparation and training, but she also knew it was just the beginning of a new phase in her career. "Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I think the real lesson from this operation is that the Navy has more capabilities than we sometimes realize. There are probably other pilots, other specialists, other personnel who have valuable skills that aren't always visible in the standard evaluation systems." Morrison smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you valuable to this organization, Lieutenant. You're absolutely right. Talent doesn't always come in the packages we expect." As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to return to her regular duties, She reflected on the events of the past 48 hours. When she had quietly risen from her seat in that briefing room, she had no idea it would lead to the most challenging and rewarding mission of her career. But she also knew that this was just one mission, one opportunity to prove herself. The real measure of her success would be whether she could maintain this level of performance consistently, whether she could continue to earn the respect of her colleagues through competence and professionalism rather than through dramatic gestures or political maneuvering. 3 months later, Sarah received orders for permanent assignment to Naval Special Warfare Command, where her expertise in high-risk combat aviation would be utilized on a regular basis. The orders came with a promotion to lieutenant commander and designation as a senior pilot qualified for special operations support. More importantly, she had established herself as the kind of pilot that commanders requested specifically when the mission was too dangerous or too complex for standard operations. She had proven that skill, preparation, and moral courage were more important than physical presence or gender stereotypes. And sometimes, that proof came from simply standing up quietly when someone asked if any battle pilots were present, and being ready to back up that claim with exceptional performance when it mattered most.